What if the person sleeping a few feet away from you was planning your death? Not a stranger. Not an intruder. Someone who shares your kitchen, your bathroom, your rent. Imagine brushing your teeth while a killer stands in the next room, calm, polite, pretending to be just another roommate trying to get by. You laugh over dinner, swap stories, argue about chores, all while having no idea that one of you won't make it out alive. Because history has shown us something terrifying. Sometimes, the deadliest people aren't lurking in dark alleys or breaking in through windows. They're already inside your home. Sleeping down the hallway. Waiting. Watching. Pretending. In apartments, dorms, shared houses, and quiet suburban homes, evil has worn the mask of friendship, convenience, and trust. Some killers didn't hide in the shadows, they paid half the rent and borrowed your charger. They knew your habits, your schedule, your fears. They didn't need to break in. They already had a key. Picture this. A roommate who smiles at you in the morning and sharpens their knives at night. A house that looks peaceful from the outside, hiding secrets soaked in blood. Victims who never suspected a thing because who would think their housemate was capable of murder? But this isn't fiction. This isn't a movie. This has happened again and again. And the most horrifying part? In many cases, there were signs, but no one recognized them until it was too late. Think about how close you are to the people you live with. You hear their footsteps. You know when they leave. You know when they're awake, and when they're still. You share walls, memories, arguments, and sometimes even your deepest secrets. But what if everything you thought you knew about them was a lie? Some of the most evil roommates in history were charming, quiet, helpful. They didn't scare their victims right away, they earned their confidence. They moved in under the guise of friendship, desperation, or opportunity. But once inside, their true intentions crawled out from under the surface. There were roommates who poisoned, who strangled, who dismembered, who stalked their victims from inside their own homes. There were pairs who killed together, roommates whose bond was built on sadism and secrecy. Some hid bodies beneath floorboards, inside closets, even under beds. Neighbors heard nothing. Families noticed nothing. And by the time the truth came out, the damage had already been done. Now ask yourself, how well do you really know the person you live with? Have you ever felt uneasy and brushed it off? Have you ever seen something odd and convinced yourself it was nothing? Because the people in these stories did the same. They excused the strange behavior, the late-night whispers, the unsettling habits. They thought danger came from outside, never realizing, death was sitting across the table. This series isn't about random violence. It's about betrayal at point-blank range. Trust turned into torture. Homes turned into graveyards. We're going to step inside the apartments, walk down the hallways, and uncover the twisted stories of roommates who didn't just share space, they shared secrets, lies, and blood. You'll hear about those who moved in with friends and never made it out. About predators who pretended to be companions, only to become executioners. Some of them killed out of rage. Some out of greed. Others, simply for the thrill. And their victims. They never saw it coming. Because who suspects the person folding laundry in the next room is dreaming about murder? So lock the doors. Check the shadows. And think carefully about who you trust. Because in this world, evil doesn't always knock before entering. Sometimes, it's already living with you. Welcome to the darkest side of shared living. The most evil roommates in history. Before the headlines. Before the horror. Before anyone suspected a thing, there was just a house, a room for rent, and two people trying to make life work. It started the way it always does, with trust. With a handshake. With someone saying, "Yeah, I don't mind sharing the place." The victim, like so many others, was just trying to get by. Maybe it was rising rent, a new city, a breakup, college, or a fresh start after life fell apart. They wanted safety, stability, a little peace. They weren't looking for danger. They weren't chasing risk. They were just trying to live. Friends described them as kind. Someone who kept to themselves but was always respectful. The type who washed the dishes, paid the bills early, and apologized for making noise. They didn't pick fights. They weren't dramatic. They believed people were mostly good, and that sharing a home meant cooperation, not chaos. They never imagined a nightmare could move in right beside them. On the other side of the story was the new roommate. Quiet. Calm. Maybe even friendly, at first. Nothing about them screamed danger. No one sensed a threat. They didn't carry themselves like a monster. Monsters rarely do. They might have said they needed a place fast. Maybe they claimed they were between jobs, going through a breakup, or trying to start over. Their story sounded believable. Their smile didn't look dangerous. They brought in a couple of bags, said thanks for the room, and that was that. Two people living under one roof. Nothing strange. Nothing alarming. Not yet. But the shift always starts small. A door left open in the middle of the night. A voice heard whispering when nobody's on the phone. Footsteps pacing in the hallway when everyone should be asleep. A feeling, just a flicker, that something is off. Maybe the victim mentioned it once. Hey, did you hear something last night? Maybe they brushed it off. He's just weird, not dangerous. Because who wants to sound paranoid about someone they barely know but have to live with? So they ignore the warning signs. They convince themselves it's nothing. Life goes on. But behind closed doors, the new roommate's story doesn't match reality. The past they didn't talk about was darker than anyone guessed. People don't just wake up one day and decide to become evil. Some arrive with it already inside them. Maybe there were red flags that didn't look like red flags at the time. A stare that lasted too long. A comment that felt off. A laugh at the wrong moment. The subtle way they watched. Still, meals were shared. Movies were watched. Bills were paid. Days passed. Weeks. And in that quiet, something else was growing, something silent, predatory, and patient. Because evil doesn't always storm in with a scream. Sometimes, it settles in, like a guest who plans to stay forever. The victim went to work, talked to friends, made weekend plans, and never once imagined that someone in the next room might be keeping a mental countdown. They slept. They dreamed. They trusted the walls around them to keep danger out, not realizing it was already inside. Nobody warned them. Nobody thought to. There was no reason to believe that roommate dinners would turn into death sentences. That a shared hallway would one day become a crime scene. But something was coming. And once it arrived, there would be no going back. Because the scariest killers aren't always the ones who break in. Sometimes, they move in. And in this house, in this story, evil wasn't lurking outside. It was sitting at the same table. Smiling. Waiting for the right moment to strike. At first, nothing seemed dangerous. Just strange. The kind of strange you notice for a moment, then shrug off because you don't want to make it a big deal. But looking back, every unsettling detail was a piece of a puzzle no one realized was being built until it was too late. It often starts with silence. Not the normal kind, but a silence that feels heavy. A stillness in the air that doesn't match the rhythm of the house. Footsteps that pause outside a bedroom door. Breathing you think you imagined. The sense that someone is standing just behind you, even though they aren't supposed to be there. The new roommate didn't make much noise, but when they did, it was usually late, moving around the kitchen at 2 a.m., opening drawers softly like they were searching for something. Sometimes, the victim would wake up and hear whispering. No TV. No phone call. Just whispers, too low to understand, like someone having a conversation with a shadow. There were other moments, little things that didn't seem threatening on their own. A door found unlocked even after someone swore they'd locked it. Cabinets left open. Items slightly moved. A glass in the sink filled with water that no one remembers pouring. The kind of details most people write off with a nervous laugh and the excuse of, maybe I'm just tired. But discomfort was creeping in. One morning, the victim noticed their bedroom door cracked open, even though they were sure they'd shut it before bed. Not wide, just enough to see the darkness of the hallway. They told themselves the wind did it. Or maybe they hadn't closed it fully. But when they mentioned it casually at breakfast, the roommate didn't react like a normal person would. No surprise, no concern, no apology. Just a stare, blank, unreadable. Then a smile that didn't match the eyes. There were moments when the roommate would appear without warning, standing at the end of a hallway, quietly watching. Not saying anything. Not blinking much. Just observing. When confronted with a joke like, "You scared me, I didn't hear you come in," they'd simply tilt their head, as if trying to figure out why that was said at all. And then came the lies. Small lies at first. About where they'd been. About who they knew. About jobs that didn't exist and family members no one ever saw. Their stories shifted slightly each time, like they couldn't remember which version they'd told. The victim didn't press too hard. After all, nobody wants to start a fight with the person they're sharing a home with. Still, the atmosphere began to change. The roommates started locking their door, even when they left for just a moment. They hid their belongings, kept their phone face down, and flinched if anyone got too close. They became protective over their room in a way that didn't make sense, like they were guarding something, or hiding it. One night, the victim passed by the roommate's door and heard something scraping sounds, slow and deliberate, like metal dragging on wood. When they knocked to check in, the noise stopped immediately. No response. No movement. Just silence on the other side, thick and intentional. Days went by. Then came another moment, one that should have set off alarms. The victim walked into the living room and saw the roommate sitting in the dark, no lights on, staring at the wall. Not a TV. Not a book. Just, sitting there. When the victim flicked on the light and asked if everything was okay, the roommate blinked slowly and muttered something under their breath. Something that sounded like, "You shouldn't worry about things you don't understand." From there, tension quietly stalked the house. The victim started double-checking the locks. Started keeping their phone closer. Started feeling their heartbeat pick up when they heard footsteps behind them, even if it was only down the hall. Instinct whispered, something isn't right. But logic pushed back. What do you even do? Move out over a feeling? Accuse someone based on a vibe? So they stayed. They hoped it was nothing. They trusted that things would calm down. They didn't. Because while the red flags were dismissed as quirks, the darkness behind them was growing bolder, closer, sharper. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The escalation wasn't sudden. It was a series of small, deliberate moves. Each one pushed the household a little closer to ruin. It began with control. A light left on when it should have been off. A thermostat turned down while someone slept. The roommates started deciding small things: what time the dishes got washed, who used the bathroom first, which shows could be watched. It seemed petty. But control is the first taste of power. The victim noticed. They laughed it off. Then came isolation. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends who once dropped by now hesitated. Invitations quietly stopped. The roommate suggested staying in more. It's safer, they said. We should keep to ourselves. A sentence like that narrowed the victim's world. Fewer faces. Fewer witnesses. Manipulation picked up speed. The roommate moved things and then said the victim misremembered. One moment they flattered. The next they cut the victim down. "You're overreacting," they'd say. Gaslighting became routine. The victim's certainty chipped away, inch by inch. Opportunities presented themselves. The roommate learned schedules and passwords. They learned who the victim loved and feared. They watched patterns, grocery nights, shifts, the friend who stopped by on Tuesdays. They timed movements to avoid witnesses. The house became territory to be mapped. Arguments followed. Small. Then larger. Voices grew louder. Objects hit walls. The victim started sleeping in shorter bursts. They took longer routes home, watching for shadows. The roommate apologized after each blow-up. "I'm sorry," they said. The apologies sounded rehearsed. Tension dissolved, then returned. The roommate's mood shifted unpredictably. Silent for days. Boisterous the next. They tested limits. How far could they go without consequence? At first a slammed door. Then a pushed shoulder. Touches that felt wrong. The victim flinched. Friends noticed bruises and asked. The victim made excuses. "I fell," they lied. Paranoia spread. Neighbors mentioned calls unanswered. The landlord stopped returning messages. The roommate changed locks without telling anyone. The house had fewer exit points for the victim. The world outside felt farther away. Planning took root. Patterns revealed intent. The roommate kept odd hours. They bought items that didn't match their story. They took late-night walks and returned with a slow smile. They practiced control. They rehearsed calm. They began to pry away the victim's supports. A pair of keys misplaced. A favorite sweater borrowed. Small conveniences vanished. The victim arrived home and found the bike missing. They called rides that never showed. The roommate offered help with a smile and then forgot to call back. The victim felt smaller. Less capable. Dependent in ways they hadn't been before. The roommate also cultivated secrecy. They left notes where they knew the victim would see them. Little messages that seemed innocent reminders, requests, casual remarks but with a tone that made the victim pause. The roommate watched to see how the person reacted. They measured fear. They enjoyed the way tiny unease spread. On a Friday the house hosted a small gathering. The victim invited a close friend. Drinks. Soft music. Easy talk. The roommate watched. They served drinks. They drifted close to conversations and slid away. Later the friend observed, "Did you notice how they never raised a glass?" After guests left, the air tightened. The roommate suggested a movie. They sat close. The victim felt pinned not physically, but by the atmosphere. Every noise felt louder. The roommate's foot brushed the victim's under the couch, a tiny contact. But it was precise. Intentional. The victim moved away. The roommate smiled, patient. That night felt different. Lights stayed dim. The house settled with an unfamiliar heaviness. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Phone screens stayed dark. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, the clock ticked too loud. The roommate had practiced for weeks without anyone recognizing rehearsal. They had narrowed options. Removed witnesses. Trained the victim to second-guess themselves. The pieces were in place. Then the moment opened. The victim, tired and trusting, let down their guard. Silence fell like a hand over the room. The air bent. Everything moved at once. It didn't happen with screaming. It didn't start with chaos. It began with quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural, like the air itself is holding its breath. The roommate waited for a night when nothing seemed wrong. No arguments. No warnings. Just stillness. The victim had gone through the usual routine: shower, Phone check, lights off. They were tired. Their guard was down. Silence wrapped around the house like a blanket. That's when the roommate moved. Slow. Calculated. Like they'd been practicing every step in their mind. They didn't rush. They didn't stumble. This wasn't impulse, this was intent. They approached the victim's door and paused, listening. The victim was asleep, or close to it. Breathing steady. Completely unaware that someone was standing just inches away. The door opened without a creak. They'd tested it days earlier. Knew exactly how much pressure to apply. The darkness inside the room was calm, and that calm made what followed even more chilling. A shadow crossed the threshold. The victim stirred slightly, but not enough to wake. Not enough to sense that death had entered the room. The roommate stood there for a moment, just watching. Some killers rush the act. Not this one. They wanted to feel in control. They wanted to savor the imbalance, one person resting, the other deciding their fate. Then came the first sound. Not loud, but wrong. The kind of noise that feels out of place in a bedroom at night. The victim's eyes snapped open. Confusion first. Then fear. They tried to speak, but shock fractured the words. By the time they understood what was happening, it was already too late. The roommate didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't show rage. There was no frantic energy, just a cold, rehearsed execution. The victim struggled, but the room was already working against them. The layout. The position of the door. The weight of exhaustion. Every detail that seemed ordinary was now part of the trap. A lamp broke during the struggle. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the shade twisting as it rolled. Not enough noise to alert the neighbors. Not enough time for the victim to reach a phone or escape. Their hands clawed at the air, at sheets, at anything but survival slipped through their fingers. The roommate's face remained almost expressionless. No panic. No hesitation. They only spoke once, voice low and unsettling, "You should have stayed quiet." A line without context. A line that hinted this wasn't sudden, this was planned. The victim's final movements were desperate, instinctive. But desperation couldn't outrun preparation. The roommate had removed every advantage. By the time the struggle ended, the room was still again, only now, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Final. But the horror didn't stop with the act itself. What happened after revealed just how calculated the killer truly was. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They sat there for a moment, breathing slowly, as if checking their own pulse. Then they began to clean, not frantically, but methodically. They wiped surfaces. Checked the hallway. Adjusted blinds. Everything done with a chilling calm. They dragged the body out of the room with alarming ease, as if this, too, had been practiced. The victim's belongings were untouched. Nothing stolen. Nothing staged to look like a break-in. Because this wasn't about theft. It was about control, and completion. The house absorbed the crime. The carpet. The walls. The silence. Even the air seemed to tighten, trapping the truth inside. And the roommate? They returned to their room and shut the door like it was just another night. Morning came, and with it, a performance. A forced knock on the victim's door. A shaky voice pretending concern, "Hey, you up? You missed your alarm." They waited just long enough before calling someone, just long enough to seem worried, yet innocent. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the killer had already constructed their story. Calm face. Practiced lines. Controlled tone. They didn't cry. They didn't flinch. They played the part of the concerned roommate flawlessly. But there are some silences that speak louder than screams. Some rooms that never feel the same again. Some stories that don't stay buried, no matter how carefully someone tries to cover them. Because even the most calculated evil always leaves a trace. The crime was brutal. The cover-up, meticulous. But like most killers who think they're smarter than everyone else, the roommate left behind cracks. And once the cracks appeared, the entire facade collapsed. It began the next morning. Friends tried calling the victim, no answer. Messages went unread. A co-worker reported them missing after they failed to show up for a shift they'd never skip. The house, from the outside, looked normal. But inside, detectives would later say, the air felt wrong. Heavy. Unsettled. Police arrived for a welfare check. The roommate opened the door, wearing the mask of concern. They played their part well, explaining the victim must have gone out, maybe without their phone, maybe upset. They even offered to help search. Calm voice. Careful words. But detectives are trained to read beyond the script. Something in the roommate's stillness, in their unblinking eyes, felt off. Inside, officers noticed inconsistencies. A chair angled strangely. A lamp broken but not reported. Cleaning supplies left out, though no one could explain why. The victim's room was too neat, almost staged, bed made, phone missing, personal items untouched. It didn't fit the profile of someone who had simply walked away. Neighbors began speaking up. They recalled late-night noises. A muffled thud. Someone moving around at odd hours. One neighbor admitted they'd seen the roommate dragging something heavy into the garage, but at the time, they hadn't thought much of it. Now, in hindsight, every detail sharpened into evidence. Detectives returned with a warrant. And that's when the story began to unravel. Forensics teams moved in. They found fibers out of place, faint smears where someone had wiped but not thoroughly. Under black light, traces appeared, proof that the house had been scrubbed, but not perfectly. On the victim's bedsheet, investigators found the smallest trace of blood. Not enough to see in daylight. Enough to tell the truth. The roommate was questioned again. This time, their story shifted. First, they claimed the victim left voluntarily. Then they said there had been an argument. Then, a fight. Each version contradicted the last. Each lie tightened the noose. Detectives watched the cracks widen, waiting for the collapse. Within days, the evidence stacked high. Security cameras from nearby streets showed the roommate moving at odd hours, carrying bags that looked far too heavy for their size. Investigators searched the garage and found faint drag marks on the concrete, leading to an empty corner that smelled strongly of bleach. The arrest was swift. Officers moved in before dawn. The roommate offered no resistance. No shouting. No denial. They simply stared, blank-eyed, as the cuffs clicked shut. In interrogation, detectives pressed. Hours passed. The killer rarely spoke, offering only short, deliberate sentences. Not confessions, just fragments. Enough to suggest knowledge, never enough to show guilt. It was the physical evidence, not their words, that sealed the case. The trial drew crowds. Reporters filled the courtroom. Families wept. The prosecution laid out the timeline with precision, the red flags, the manipulation, the moment of the crime. The defense tried to spin a story of accident, of misunderstanding. But the details didn't align. Too much cleaning. Too many lies. Too much silence when there should have been grief. And through it all, the roommate sat motionless. No tears. No anger. No flicker of remorse. They watched the proceedings like an outsider, as if the testimony described someone else entirely. Witnesses later said the most haunting part wasn't the evidence, it was the emptiness in their expression. Even in the courtroom, one journalist wrote, their face showed no regret. Not for the victim. Not for the family. Not for anyone. The jury deliberated. Hours stretched into a day. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent, Guilty. The sentence was heavy: life without parole. A punishment meant to ensure the world would never have to share space with them again. But punishment didn't erase the horror. Friends of the victim spoke about sleepless nights, about replaying every ignored warning sign. Neighbors double-checked locks. Families reminded loved ones to be cautious about who they trusted. The case left scars that went beyond the courtroom. The house itself stood empty for months. Potential tenants walked through, only to leave quickly. They said the place felt wrong. Cold. Haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. And the roommate? They disappeared into a cell, where silence became their only companion. The same silence they once used as a weapon. Because in the end, justice may have been served, but the question still lingered in the minds of everyone who followed the case. How well do we really know the people we live with? Evil doesn't always break down the door. Sometimes, it quietly drags in a suitcase, pays half the rent, and smiles over dinner. That's what makes this story so disturbing: not just the crime itself, but the slow, silent path that led to it. A home, a routine, a shared space, all twisted into a trap before anyone realized the danger was already inside. The victim never imagined that trust would be their downfall. They didn't lie recklessly. They weren't careless. They simply believed that the walls around them kept them safe. But safety isn't always about doors and locks, it's about people. And sometimes, the greatest threat is the one sitting across the table. The roommate didn't kill out of desperation or panic. They planned. They waited. They studied every habit, every weakness, every moment of vulnerability. To outsiders, they looked calm, even ordinary. But ordinary faces can hide the darkest intentions. That's why these cases linger long after the sentence is read, because they force us to question what we think we know. Think about it: how many people do we let into our lives without really knowing who they are? A coworker who needs a place to stay. A friend of a friend looking for a room. A stranger with a nice smile and the right answers. We open the door, share the rent, split the chores, and never consider the possibility that one day, we might not wake up. After the trial, after the verdict, after the sentence, people tried to move on. But the unease didn't fade. Friends of the victim replayed conversations, searching for clues they missed. Neighbors wished they'd knocked on the door when they heard something. Family members asked themselves the hardest question of all: could this have been prevented? Even investigators admitted something chilling: if just one step in the roommate's plan had gone differently, this story might still be unsolved. The lies, the timing, the cleanup, all of it carried the cold precision of someone who believed they were untouchable. And the killer? They never apologized. Never explained. Never showed a hint of sorrow. Even when confronted with the evidence, photos, timelines, testimony, they stared ahead with the same calm they had the night of the murder. As if they didn't just destroy a life, but simply completed something they believed was inevitable. That kind of emptiness doesn't just frighten people, it stays with them. It forces you to wonder how many others walk among us with the same hollow stare and the same hidden patience. How many pretend to be harmless while quietly sharpening their intentions. And that leads to the question none of us want to ask, but everyone thinks about after hearing a story like this. What if someone you live with is hiding who they really are? Maybe you've seen things that felt off, but you brushed them aside. Maybe there's a moment you keep replaying in your head, something small you never spoke about, but now you can't forget. Maybe there's a habit, a look, a sound at night that you've trained yourself to ignore. But ignoring danger doesn't make it disappear. These stories are more than true crime, they're warnings. Not every roommate is a threat, but history proves one thing painfully clear: evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes, it signs the lease and learns your schedule. So now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever lived with someone who made you uneasy even if you couldn't explain why? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else see the signs before it's too late. If this case gripped you and made you think twice about the people we trust, make sure you like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more true crime stories just like this. Your support helps us uncover more chilling cases and shine a light where darkness tries to hide. Stay safe. Stay aware. And remember, the scariest monsters don't always sneak in. Sometimes, they already have a key.